This is Eleanor Roosevelt's retreat, and her home is over there, which you will soon see. And I'm sure she would be so happy to meet you and welcome you to this.
I'm sure she's looking
place.
down on all of us.
Yes,
This is a kind of a
And then introduce yourselves.
and introduce herself.
Yeah.
What I will do is, this is Kathleen Durham. She's the director of the Eleanor Roosevelt Center.
Yes.
And next to me is Professor Glen Johnsson. He was, so far I understood, the chairboard member of the
That's right.
center.
Yeah.
That's
Okay.
right.
And myself, I'm Stephan Mögle-Stadel. I'm the guide of this World Citizen Tour, journalist and book author. And I'm glad to bring the people here together in this historical site and to this both historical persons, Eleanor Roosevelt and Garry Davis.
Absolutely. And
Very
thank
good.
you for coming, really, and welcome.
I think the most important role of Eleanor Roosevelt as chair of this commission is that I don't think you would have had a document called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights had it not been for Eleanor Roosevelt, because I do not think there was anyone capable of bringing such disparate groups and thoughts together.
And by bringing different groups together, it has some perspective of really building a global community where you have not a monolithic view, but you have a lot of different views where you must keep somehow together. And later on, I want to mention the influence Eleanor Roosevelt have had on the second Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld. But before this, because his career at the UN starts at 53, 5 years after this declaration,
Yes.
but he was still attending as a guest of the Swedish delegation these meetings, because he was vice director of the economic reconstruction program for Europe at this time, and the headquarters was there in Paris, and so from time to time he attends their meetings because he was interested in United Nations affairs as a high-rank officer from the Foreign Ministry of Sweden, and he also attends a meeting where Garry Davis and Albert Camus and others interrupted to do this World Citizen proclamation and declaration, and maybe we can go on what it means for his area later on as Secretary General. But at first I wanted to mention that Eleanor Roosevelt mentioned Garry Davis twice in her columns, My Day. Their column, I guess, is run through the whole US, printed in different newspapers like New York Times, Washington Post, and so on. And at the My Day column at the December the 15th, 48, she said how very much better it would be if Mr. Davis would set up his own governmental organization and start then and there a worldwide international government. It was this struggle era, if the UN is too slow in an atomic age, if they are really fit up with time and so on. I think from this perspective she probably did it. And she mentioned Garry again in her column at December 23rd, where she also goes back to the World Citizen movement. At this time was really at the headlines of the newspapers. Today, well, you will search and you will find only a few about it, but at this time, Le Monde, New York City, New York Times all covers this World Citizen things and events were going on. And for this I wanted to give the word to Garry to how his perspective was in 48 as he come to Paris and see all this stuff going on with the governmental guys and so on, to do this action as he did. Maybe you can explain a little bit from this background what you feel that this time is necessary to do and how you got the idea to do what you did.
Well, my first main thing about human rights is that they should be declared by the humans concerned. And one of the declarations which I made is put into an Article 15, Section 2 of the very declaration itself. And it says that everyone is entitled to a nationality, but everyone is entitled to change their nationality. It's a very interesting article, because if you can change your nationality, then it means that each individual is permitted to claim his or her allegiance, political allegiance, and say who they are. And that, to me, is one of the key elements that is brought out in the Declaration of Human Rights. Confirming that, of course, is Article 21, Section 3, which says, the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. Now that, if you look at the United Nations today, you see that the United Nations is only composed of nations and that individuals are not really considered. And yet, in the very Charter of the United Nations, human rights is mentioned 17 times. And Article 56 of the Charter of the United Nations makes it very clear that all the nation-state members shall observe and respect fundamental human rights. And I think that's why the Commission was set up, because they were not defined in the Charter. So it took 3 years, as we all know, for that Commission to finally come up with those 30 articles. And the 30 articles really, if you look at it objectively, contradict the premise of the United Nations itself. Because you look at the words United Nations and you say something's wrong with that title, because nations, by definition, are sovereign and ununited and perpetuate a condition of anarchy between them. So in a way, it's an oxymoron, the words United Nations. And therefore, my feeling as a pilot, former pilot, B-17 pilot in World War II, entering, when I was in the war, when I was a pilot, the so-called nuclear age, where the weaponry went from relative to absolute. And in a way that rendered the United Nations obsolete, and in fact, the whole business of national security obsolete. And that then put a responsibility of each one of us to exercise the first right of being a human being, which is, of course, to survive. All the rest is incidental. If you don't survive, then there are no human rights. So I figured that out when I was 26 years old. And I decided that survival, and that's put into the preamble to the Declaration of Human Rights, that human rights should be protected by a regime of law. And what does that mean to all of us? It means that law begins with each one of us. And we are the sovereign of the world law. So it fell into my lot to exercise my rights to claim that I was a world citizen. And nobody could deny that claim, because the first thing I did was, of course, to renounce my nationality. And that, to me, fit right into the whole code of the Declaration of Human Rights. And other people agreed, and therefore that started a whole, what shall I say, I don't like to call it movement, but a flood of people throughout the world who said, we are the sovereigns of this world, it's our world, and we have to protect it. And I think that's the basis of Eleanor Roosevelt's mission, when she says that her mission was, the Declaration was her final mission. If you read the Declaration thoroughly, it's, as it says right at the beginning, defines human rights, doesn't define national rights. And when she wrote in her column on the 15th of December about how we had interrupted a session of the United Nations in Paris, and our first words were, we interrupt in the name of the people not represented here. The delegates you represent divide us and lead us to the abyss of total war. I think she knew that, and in fact, as Stephan reminded me yesterday, Dag Hammarskjöld happened to be in that very session. And we carried on. We said, what we need is one government for one world. And if you don't do it, step aside, because we're going to do it ourselves. And our final words were, we can be served by nothing less. And if you read the Declaration of Human Rights very clearly, in the preamble of the very Declaration of Human Rights, it says, human rights should be protected by a regime of law. And that's why I've been exercising my right to be a lawful human being, a lawful world citizen, and exercising my right to contract with every other human being who claims to be a world citizen, a legal contract of law. In other words, peace. We use peace very glibly. The nations do it all the time. All the politicians talk about peace, as if the nations could make peace, but they don't. They cannot. They're on the wrong level. Because peace now has to become global, or the human race will be eliminated by the nuclear weapons, which are in the hands of 9 human beings now, and targeted against humanity. So I am very delighted to be here. I've always wanted to come here. Eleanor Roosevelt and I have a kind of a historic rapport, and she put it into her My Day column. As Stephan brought out, she wrote that Garry Davis interrupted the session on the 22nd of November with his friends and called upon the United Nations to transform itself into a world government. In that very column, she says, but the United Nations cannot become a government. She wrote that. It cannot become a government because it's only composed of sovereign states. And then she added that maybe it's better that they can talk together than fight. But she did not carry that thought through, which the Declaration of Human Rights actually does. It does not mention world government, but on Article 28, it does mention a social and international order. There's kind of a contradiction. You say international order because you're using relative words, international, and then order is a ontological word. It's a holistic word. But anyway, that is as close as the Declaration comes to saying world government. So we went further, and on September 4th, as people here know, after having registered hundreds of thousands of people as world citizens, we declared our own government. And this government is functioning, this government is evolving, and this government is the sine qua non of making a peaceful world.
This might be a good point to ask Professor Glen Johnsson how he views these events who are going on in this year 48, 49 from his perspective as an academic with a background of political science. At first, how Eleanor struggled for this declaration, and second, that something surprisingly arises, as we know from the philosophic sector. This idea is very old of world citizenship, ancient Greeks and so on, but now it arises to a social movement. I guess it must be also interesting for to take a look on a view on political science. What's going on in this year?
Well, background is not so much in this movement, which Garry has talked about and has spearheaded for all these years, but more in the work that Eleanor Roosevelt did. And it should be said that it wasn't just 1948. You have to go back earlier than 1948. And I agree with Kathleen. I think without Eleanor Roosevelt, you wouldn't have this document for reasons that we'll talk about. But it is certainly clear that the mood to talk about human rights was there before 1948 and before Eleanor Roosevelt got involved in it at the international level. Garry Davis has already pointed out that the UN Charter mentions human rights many times. This is very unusual for an international treaty. Before the UN Charter, If you go back to the League of Nations, there's no mention of human rights in the League of Nations covenant. It doesn't exist. How did it get in the United Nations Charter then, which was, after all, the successor institution to the League of Nations? It got there not because the major powers wanted it there. Even the United States wanted it only, that is, at the government level, wanted it only in the preamble to the Charter. They didn't want it anywhere else. But when they got to San Francisco, and by the way, the other major powers that met at Dunbarton Oaks to develop the beginnings of the UN Charter didn't even want it mentioned at all. The British didn't want it mentioned at all. The Soviets didn't want it mentioned at all. But the Americans wanted it in the preamble. But when they got to San Francisco to put the final touches on the Charter, they found, the great powers found two things. They found, first of all, that there were a lot of smaller countries, mainly from Latin America, that were insistent that if we were going to have an international organization now, it had to be different from the international organization that had gone before. And it had to be focused on people as well as states. And therefore, you had to include a mandate dealing with human rights. Some of them actually wanted to include in the Charter a Bill of Rights, like the American Bill of Rights, or a declaration like the Universal Declaration. They wanted to include it, but it didn't get included. The other thing they found was a group of American citizens, ordinary citizens, non-government, that Franklin Roosevelt had brought in to the whole process of the American decisions about the United Nations Charter. Why had he brought them in? Because he had been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy when the League of Nations Covenant was developed by Wilson. And he saw how the League of Nations Covenant failed to capture American support, public support in America. And he was determined that wasn't going to happen again. And so he enlisted all of these ordinary people in the process. But what he found out, or he didn't find it out because he was dead by then, at San Francisco, what the American delegation found out was once you enlist these people, they have ideas of their own. And one of their ideas was that you had to devote more attention to human rights and not just national rights when you were writing this charter. That Franklin Roosevelt had brought in to the whole process of the American decisions about the United Nations Charter. Why had he brought them in? Because he had been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy when the League of Nations Covenant was developed by Wilson. And he saw how the League of Nations Covenant failed to capture American support, public support in America. And he was determined that wasn't going to happen again. And so he enlisted all of these ordinary people in the process. But what he found out, or he didn't find it out because he was dead by then, at San Francisco, what the American delegation found out was once you enlist these people, they have ideas of their own. And one of their ideas was that you had to devote more attention to human rights and not just national rights when you were writing this charter. So as a result of those two pressures from the smaller states, primarily in Latin America, and from American ordinary citizens organized in non-governmental groups, you got this emphasis on the United Nations, on human rights in the United Nations Charter. Think how important that is. There is one commission only mandated by the UN Charter, and that is a commission on human rights. It says that the Economic and Social Council shall create a human rights commission and such other commissions as it may find useful. There's only one that's mandated by name, and that's the one on human rights. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt had nothing to do with that up to that point. Nothing to do with it at all. Her work until then, as long as her husband was alive, her work had been mainly in the American domestic scene. She worked on labor rights, on rights of African Americans, on women's rights. She was very active in all of those areas, but they were all at the domestic level, not at the international level. She had no real experience in the international level. But she was named by Truman to the first United Nations delegation, partly as a symbol of the connection with the Roosevelts, but partly also, I have to tell you, frankly, for political reasons. Harry Truman was at that time a pretty unknown politician, facing, we forget what life was like in those days because it's so long ago. But imagine yourself, Harry Truman, a small-time politician, almost an accidental vice president of the United States, selected as vice president primarily because he was unobjectionable to anybody. He didn't know Franklin Roosevelt. He met with Franklin Roosevelt twice between the time Roosevelt was elected to his fourth term and the time Roosevelt died. He knew practically nothing that was going on. But here he was now confronted with Mrs. Roosevelt, who was the longtime partner of her husband for 12 years in the White House, and who had a political stature of her own. Very important figure in the Democratic Party, much more important than Harry Truman was. What was Harry Truman going to do with Eleanor Roosevelt? He certainly didn't want to put her in charge of relations dealing with African Americans, because she might want to do something that would alienate the southern wing of the Democratic Party, which he relied on. He didn't want to put her in charge of women's rights because she might have real ambitions to do something about women's rights, which he didn't have. He didn't want to put her in charge of labor because she might have ideas there that would cause him trouble. So where to put her? Over dealing with international affairs. She doesn't know much about that. We'll put her over there. And literally, this is what happened. And the people who were on the top of the American delegation were very upset with Mrs. Roosevelt's appointment. Very upset with it. They didn't want her there. And they told him so. But Truman, for political reasons, kept her there. So what to do now that she was there? Well, all of these senior members of the American delegation, of course, knew that the real meat of the United Nations, as Garry Davis was implying, was in the Security Council, where, as one of my students used to say, the big boys played. You're right? They dealt with security and all those things. So you didn't want to put her there. These other guys would play that role. John Foster Dulles and Warren Austin, and those people would play that role. So we'll relegate her to do what was considered then women's work, Economic and Social Council. We'll put her over there, where nothing important's going to happen, and she can be symbolic. But it was under the Economic and Social Council that the Human Rights Commission was mandated by the Charter. And so they created the Human Rights Commission. And Mrs. Roosevelt, as the delegate to the Economic and Social Council, became the American delegate to the Human Rights Commission. And what happened the first time they met? Her fellow delegates proceeded to elect her chair of the commission. It wasn't the American government that did that. It was her fellow delegates who elected her as chair of that commission. So there she was, suddenly chair of a commission that was mandated by the Charter for the first time as an international group to actually do something about human rights. The question was, what to do about human rights? Think about this for a minute. There was no precedent for this. No other group in history had ever been asked as official representatives of governments to do something about human rights. So she had, in effect, a kind of blank slate. She was, of that commission, with her were a bunch of very distinguished international lawyers. She was not a lawyer of any kind. And she was confronted with the question of what to do. Most of her colleagues on the commission said, well, we'll write treaties. That's what we'll do. We'll write treaties. That's what lawyers do. They write treaties. I hope nobody in here is a lawyer. Yes, well, of course, Catherine, you're a last lawyer, so you're all right. Mrs. Roosevelt said, yes, of course we will write legally binding treaties. Of course we will do that. But, she said, I know how lawyers work. I was married to one. I know lots of other lawyers. I know how lawyers work. And if we only do that, it will be forever, and nothing will happen. And the people of the world, didn't press the governments to create this commission to have it fritter its time away year after year after year, dotting every I and crossing every T in order to get a legally binding document. They want us to do something now.
Especially the European
Well, yes, especially the Europeans. All of these people. And so they wanted something done. So Mrs. Roosevelt said, we should at least write a declaration. We should write, for the first time, we should write a document that represents the consensus of the world about what constitutes human rights, basic human rights. That in many ways is the initial significance of the Universal Declaration. It was the first time that a global effort was made to write down in writing what basic fundamental human rights were, to define them in that way. Other groups had done that, but no groups that represented official governmental level activities. Now, Mrs. Roosevelt, I have to tell you, was, as I said, she was not a lawyer. She was not a draftsperson with respect to all of these documents. She did not write the Universal. There's a big argument that goes on. You will not be surprised that the French argue that René Cassin, the distinguished French lawyer, wrote the Universal Declaration. Canada, are you going to Canada on this trip at all? No? There is a human rights center at McGill University named for John Humphrey, who was the Canadian representative on the staff person on the Human Rights Commission for the UN Secretariat. They will claim there that John Humphrey was the right author of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. No one claims that for Eleanor Roosevelt. She didn't write it. In fact, no specific person wrote it. Cassin put together from a lot of different documents the basic document from which they eventually worked. But that document was a document that really had input from people from all over the world at that time. Of course, as you all know, many countries had no representatives there at that time because they were still under colonial rule. And of course they didn't have representatives. But those that did were there. Mrs. Roosevelt her role was really to prod them and push them. Or as she said in one of her My Day columns, to insist that they put the high thoughts and legal principles in words that ordinary people could understand. She insisted on that and prodded them over and over. There's a wonderful apocryphal story that after one particularly long meeting of the Human Rights Commission that Mrs. Roosevelt was presiding over, one of the delegates turned to her and said, Mrs. Roosevelt, please, even delegates to the Human Rights Commission have human rights. Basically, nothing would have happened for 20 years or 40 years, or even now, the American ratification of it has so many reservations attached to it that some in the human rights community think we would be better off if the United States had never ratified them. Because under international law, any reservation we claim, other states can claim as well. And so a lot of the importance of these treaties has been vitiated by the reservations that the United States has put in. So in a way, Mrs. Roosevelt was right, that what they needed to do was adopt this provision that they could do early. Now, the United States insisted all the way through, and most other countries did too, that there was nothing binding in the Universal Declaration. It's not a binding, it's simply a statement. It's not binding. And in a technical sense, that is correct. In a technical, legal sense, that is correct. But it is very interesting. When the Universal Declaration came up for a vote in the United Nations, it was adopted without a dissenting vote. But there were 8 abstentions. 6 of those abstentions came from the Soviet Union and its allies, right? On exactly the grounds that Garry Davis was referring to before, that their argument was the Declaration spent too much time talking about human rights and not enough about states' rights, the rights of states. They kept wanting to put in more emphasis on the rights of states. And the Universal Declaration says nothing about the rights of states. It says something about the rights of communities, that is, collectivities. The Soviets wanted that to say states, but the rest of the other delegates insisted that it not be states, but it be communities.
May I add a footnote to
Yeah,
this?
sure.
We had a meeting on the 9th of December at the Velodrome d'Hiver. The vote, of course, was on the 10th of December.
Right.
And as far as I know, and you can confirm me if you will, the communist government was going to vote no
Right.
on 10th. The meeting, however, attracted 20,000 people. It was the largest meeting at the Velodrome d'Hiver they ever had. The Velodrome d'Hiver was the Madison Square Garden of Paris. We had had meetings before then at the Salle Pleyel, 3,000 people and so forth. And we had a council of solidarity of intellectuals that supported world citizenship at that time. People like Albert Camus and Schweitzer and so forth, and Jean. Anyway, so as far as the story goes, that the communist bloc, seeing this meeting on the 9th, which was a tremendous, there were meetings all over the world actually on the 9th of December, decided that they could not vote either
That's interesting.
yes or no.
Yeah.
So therefore, those 6, that communist bloc
Right.
abstained.
Right.
And the next day, all the other nations voted, and it was proclaimed
of human rights is in the Charter, which is a treaty and which is legally binding. And what this declaration avowedly purports to do is to define what those human rights are. So they are protected by the Charter. This simply says what they are. And therefore, he said, in the future, people will argue that this is, in fact, a legally binding document. Of course, that's exactly what has happened. Now, many, many people, most international lawyers, I think, argue that this has become a legally binding document as a part of customary international law. And so, in a sense, the South African representative was right. Even that didn't bring him to vote no, because he didn't want to be the only no vote. So he only abstained as well. Yes.
And perhaps you talk about the Florida case where that was brought into U.S. law, or Garry, are you familiar with that?
Which one?
Garry, you want to tell them about the case where it was brought into U.S. law as binding?
Yeah, there's a very famous case, Philartica versus Arala.
Yeah.
Maybe you know that one.
Yeah.
Where they used the declaration in the Second District Court
Yes.
to make the decision
Right.
as to whether PINA should be indicted.
Much more so than in Europe, where you have a different kind of tradition. A socialist, a European socialism welfare has always been a much more prominent part of human rights discourse in Europe than it has been in the United States.
I guess Garry wants to add something to
I
this.
have one comment to make relevant to this conversation, and I think we should underline this, that governments are started by people. And if you think back to the 1787 conference at the Independence Hall, it's quite clear that these 55 men imagined a whole new government and put it together. By virtue of what? By virtue of the fact that they were sovereign human beings, and they have political choice. And I think this is forgotten, and I don't know whether you've ever read my writ of certiorari to the Supreme Court, but I brought this up and used the Ninth Amendment as my legal argument. The Ninth Amendment, of course, is which nobody knows because doesn't spell out any rights, but it simply says that all the rights enunciated in the Constitution do not disparage or deny other rights retained by the people. And if you analyze that, rights retained by the people, of course, are inalienable. And therefore, those are the rights that the Founding Fathers actually used to found the government in the first place. Well, here we are 200 years later. We're in the 21st century and all face the same questions of survival and global warming and all that. So let's go back to the core issue and say that the people of the world per se are sovereign, and we're all human beings, and now we have evidence of it through the biological code and so forth and so on. So this idea that we have the right to choose our own political allegiance actually is confirmed by the Founding Fathers of the United States via the Ninth Amendment and so forth. And I wrote that in my writ of certiorari, and nobody has said anything. The U.S. government has said, you're an excludable alien, get out. And they can't exclude me because as far as I am concerned, as a world citizen, this is my right to claim my own allegiance. And I think that's the fundamental basis of this, and what Eleanor Roosevelt actually had in mind when she said these are human rights. Right. And we are the humans concerned, and it's the humans, therefore, who have to recognize them and claim them. It's not for governments to ratify declarations of human rights. So that's my final.
May I just add one thing, because I think it's really important to note that with the rights that are spoken about, as we've discussed, also in the Declaration, it's very obvious that we have an obligation. We have obligations. We don't just have rights. We also have an obligation to be that kind of citizen that allows other people to exercise their rights, or to be that kind of citizen that gets its government to do what it needs to do. So I just want to, so rights don't stand alone, they come with obligations. Eleanor Roosevelt was very clear about that. You cannot have one without the other.
And one thing which we discovered later on, 5 years later, as Dag Hammarskjöld took office as Secretary General, influenced by Eleanor Roosevelt. They have a long-time relationship starting in 1932, 1933, and also influenced by what happens in 1948 with the World Citizen Movement. There you can see, not in theory, by drafting, but step by step he creates a real daily politics who goes in the direction of human rights politics, of a politic not for the different nations, but for humanity as a whole. As you see the Suez Channel crisis, as we introduce the blue helmets, you don't find it in a charter, yes? And step by step, he also played an active role in decolonization. And by doing so, he knows that in a General Assembly, he gets a lot of young nation states who are in favor of his politics. And it worked out latest in 1956 in the Suez Channel crisis, because there the Security Council was blocked through veto from France and from Great Britain. So what did Dag Hammarskjöld, and this is, I would say, world citizen politics, he said, okay, the council is blocked, I take this resolution now in front of the General Assembly and ask the General Assembly for permission to start this blue helmet thing. It's called the Uniting for Peace resolution. He used something he had used in Korea for other purpose and so on, put it around, yes, brought it again into the General Assembly. On this basis, he got the blue helmets, and surprisingly, 48 hours later, the first Danish and Swedish blue helmets started to Egypt, because he has a personal agreement with the Nordic nations that if he got through this United for Peace resolution, say at this evening, it was evenings there in Europe, it was here 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the parliament of Norway and Sweden come together at the main capitals and change the constitution to give allowance for Swedish and Norwegian and Danish troops and so on for going in foreign countries, because there were really defensive armies and it was from constitution forbidden for them to go around in the world. They changed it within 2 hours in midnight, and they even have trained some troops, weeks before. So you see, one thing is treaties between lawyers, but the other thing is, by the way, he was a lawyer by itself, but not only a lawyer, if a man who really wants to do something, who catches the spirit and takes the courage, could even step by step fit out such treaties and such organizations really going in a direction of global governance, what we call it today, and really of politics for humanity and of human rights politics. So it is possible without having every signature under the treaty, if the right man is in the right
myself a world citizen 8 months before the Declaration came out. I didn't need the Declaration of Human Rights.
No, and I think she recognized that. Is what I think when I read it, she's saying she is acknowledging you for having stepped up before to do what it was you felt was right.
And also, that's one of the most ancient ideas is world citizenship. Nothing new about it.
And she was, after all, the first lady of the world.
Sure.
Well, don't forget also the heritage of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, because in a good way he was a high-rank Freemason. And if you see in the philosophy of Freemasonry, humanity itself and also human rights, like it happened in the thought of enlightenment in Europe, was a very important point. So also in her work you will find some of this heritage of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was very much behind that this United Nations ever got in existence. This we should also keep in mind. So now we are running out of time. I thank you very much, Professor Glen Johnsson, Kathleen Durham, and Garry Davis, to joining us for this discussion. And thank you very much for your attention and to be patient for this time.
Thank you.